A black teen walks into a bank to deposit her hard-earned cash, but the teller takes one look at her and accuses her of lying. What she doesn't know: the girl's mother is the most powerful CEO in finance, and she's about to walk through that door. The bank was busy, filled with the usual midday rush of customers depositing checks, withdrawing cash, and speaking with financial advisors. Among them was 17-year-old Kayla Johnson, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She walked confidently to the counter, holding a deposit slip and a thick stack of cash, her hard-earned paycheck from her part-time job. Lisa Montgomery, a bank teller in her mid-30s with a perfectly polished appearance, glanced up as Kayla approached. Her expression shifted from neutral to suspicious as she eyed the young black girl standing before her. "Can I help you?" Lisa asked, her tone clipped and unwelcoming. Kayla smiled politely. "Yes, I'd like to deposit this into my account," she said, sliding the cash forward. Lisa paused, staring at the money as if it were something foreign. Then, with a raised eyebrow, she asked, "Where did you get this?" Kayla blinked, caught off guard by the question. "From my job," she replied, her voice tinged with confusion. Lisa scoffed. "You expect me to believe a girl like you has this much money?" she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. Kayla's smile faded. "Excuse me?" The air in the bank grew thick with tension as Lisa, the teller, leaned slightly over the counter, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the marble surface. Her eyes, narrowed and skeptical, locked onto Kayla's face as if searching for cracks in her story. The question she had just asked, "Where did you really get this?" hung between them like an accusation, heavy with implication. Kayla felt her stomach tighten. She had walked into the bank with the simple expectation of depositing her paycheck, just like any other customer. But the way Lisa was looking at her, like she was some kind of criminal, sent a cold ripple of unease down her spine. She had heard stories, of course. Stories about black people being followed in stores, questioned for simply existing in certain spaces, treated like they didn't belong. But she had never expected it to happen to her. Not here, not in her own neighborhood bank where she'd been a customer for years. "It's from my job at Millie's Diner," Kayla repeated, her voice steady despite the growing frustration simmering beneath her skin. She reached into her backpack, fingers brushing against the folded pay stubs she always kept in the front pocket. "I have my pay stubs right here if you need proof." Lisa's lips pursed into a thin line, her gaze flicking dismissively between the cash and Kayla's outstretched hand holding the documents. Instead of taking them, she waved her hand in a gesture that was almost theatrical in its condescension. "I'm going to need more than that," she said, her tone clipped. "Large cash deposits require additional verification." Kayla's breath hitched. Large cash deposit? It was a few $100s, hardly an amount that should raise eyebrows in a busy downtown bank. Her eyes darted to the side, where just moments ago, a middle-aged white man in a business suit had deposited a thick stack of bills without so much as a second glance from Lisa. No questions, no suspicion, just a polite smile and a "Have a nice day, sir." The unfairness of it burned. "But the man in front of me just deposited cash," Kayla said, her voice firmer now. "You didn't ask him any questions." Lisa's posture stiffened, her shoulders squaring as if bracing for an argument. "That's different," she snapped, her voice dropping lower, as if she were sharing some unspoken truth Kayla was too naive to understand. Different. The word echoed in Kayla's mind, sharp and ugly. Different how? Because he was older? Because he was white? Because he wore a suit and carried a briefcase while she wore a hoodie and carried a backpack? The unspoken assumptions behind that single word made her blood run hot. Lisa must have seen the defiance in Kayla's eyes because her expression hardened, her next words delivered with a quiet, threatening edge. "I suggest you cooperate," she said, leaning in slightly, "or I'll have to report this as suspicious activity." The threat was clear. Suspicious activity. Words that could trigger holds on accounts, calls to managers, even, in worst-case scenarios, law enforcement involvement. All because a black girl dared to deposit her own money. Kayla's hands clenched slightly around the strap of her backpack. She had always been taught to stand up for herself, to never let anyone make her feel small. But this This was more than just rudeness. This was systemic bias playing out in real time, and the power dynamic was painfully clear. Lisa held the authority here. She could delay Kayla's deposit, flag her account, make her life difficult if she wanted to. And for what? Because she didn't believe a black teenager could have legitimately earned a few $100s. For a heartbeat, Kayla considered walking away, maybe coming back later, hoping for a different teller. But then, she thought of all the times people like her had been forced to swallow their pride, to accept unfair treatment just to avoid making a scene. No, she wouldn't do that. Not today. She opened her mouth to respond. Whether to demand a manager or call out the blatant discrimination, she wasn't even sure, when the bank's heavy glass doors swung open behind her. A hush fell over the lobby, the usual murmur of customers and clicking keyboards dimming into near silence. And then, a voice, smooth, authoritative, and unmistakably furious, cut through the tension like a knife. Is there a problem here? Kayla didn't even need to turn around to know who had just walked in. Lisa's face drained of color. The atmosphere in the bank shifted palpably the moment the glass doors swung open with a soft chime. A sudden hush fell over the normally bustling lobby, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Customers mid-conversation paused, tellers looked up from their workstations, and even the constant clicking of keyboards seemed to momentarily cease. All attention was drawn to the striking figure who had just entered, Vanessa Johnson, Kayla's mother and the CEO of one of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. Vanessa moved with the effortless grace of someone accustomed to command, her designer heels clicking decisively against the polished marble floor. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit that accentuated her statuesque frame, she carried an aura of authority that demanded respect. Her sharp eyes, framed by perfectly arched brows, immediately locked onto the scene at the counter, taking in her daughter's tense posture and the teller's defensive stance with a single sweeping glance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Vanessa approached. Lisa, who moments before had been so confident in her position of power, now visibly stiffened. Her previously smug expression morphed into one of dawning recognition and horror as she realized exactly who had walked in. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion ashen, and her hands, which had been confidently sorting Kayla's cash, now trembled slightly against the counter. "Mom!" Kayla's voice was a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. The single word carried volumes, the hurt of being unjustly accused, the frustration of being doubted, and now the vindication of having someone powerful in her corner. Vanessa's presence immediately recalibrated the power dynamic that had been so skewed against her daughter just moments before. Vanessa's gaze flickered between Kayla and Lisa, her sharp business instincts immediately piecing together what had transpired. The stack of cash still sitting on the counter, the defensive set of Lisa's shoulders, the way Kayla's backpack straps were clenched tightly in her fists. These were all clues to the confrontation that had been interrupted. Without raising her voice, Vanessa asked the simple but devastating question. Is there a problem here? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Lisa's mouth opened and closed several times, resembling a fish gasping for air. The confidence she had wielded against a teenage girl evaporated in the face of genuine authority. Her eyes darted around the bank, searching for an escape route, or perhaps hoping a manager would materialize to save her from this nightmare scenario. Vanessa didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her mere presence exuded an authority that came not just from her position, but from years of navigating corporate boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. She stood with perfect posture, one hand resting lightly on her designer handbag, the other casually at her side. Every detail of her appearance, from the subtle gleam of her diamond stud earrings to the understated elegance of her wristwatch, spoke of someone who belonged in spaces of power and expected to be treated accordingly. The contrast between mother and daughter in this moment was striking. Where Kayla had been dismissed for her youth and casual attire, Vanessa's maturity and professional appearance commanded immediate respect. Where Kayla's assertions had been questioned, Vanessa's very presence demanded answers. The racial bias that had colored Lisa's interaction with Kayla was suddenly laid bare. The same assumptions that had led her to doubt a black teenager didn't hold up against a black woman who clearly occupied the highest echelons of corporate power. As the silence stretched, Lisa finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. Ms. Johnson. The recognition in her tone was tinged with something akin to terror. This wasn't just any customer she had been harassing. This was someone with real influence, someone who could make or break careers with a single phone call. Vanessa arched one perfectly shaped eyebrow, her expression coolly assessing. Yes, and you are. The question was delivered with deliberate casualness, but its implications were devastating. In just 4 words, Vanessa had reduced Lisa from a position of authority to someone who needed to justify her very presence. The scene had now completely transformed. What had begun as a routine banking transaction had become a stark demonstration of how prejudice operates, and how quickly the dynamics of power can shift when the marginalized individual suddenly has influential backing. The other bank customers watched with rapt attention, some subtly edging closer to hear the unfolding drama, while tellers at other stations froze mid-transaction, their routines forgotten in light of this extraordinary confrontation. Vanessa's arrival had turned the tables completely, exposing the hypocrisy of Lisa's earlier behavior. The same questions that had seemed so reasonable when directed at a black teenager now appeared blatantly discriminatory when faced with the reality that this suspicious individual was the daughter of one of the most respected figures in the city's financial world. The unspoken rules of racial and class bias had been appended, and Lisa now found herself on the wrong side of the power dynamic she had so confidently wielded just moments before. The bank lobby, once filled with the usual hum of transactions and casual chatter, had become utterly still. Every eye was locked onto the confrontation unfolding at the counter. A confrontation that had, in mere seconds, shifted from a routine deposit into a searing indictment of racial bias in banking. Vanessa Johnson did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet intensity of her presence was enough to make Lisa shrink back, her earlier arrogance evaporating like mist under the morning sun. Vanessa's gaze never wavered from Lisa's face as she repeated her question, her tone lethally calm. Is that true? Lisa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her throat worked uselessly, her earlier confidence replaced by the dawning horror of realization. She had just accused the CEO's daughter of lying about her own money. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as Lisa scrambled for an excuse, a justification, anything to deflect the weight of Vanessa's judgment. I was just following protocol, Lisa stammered at last, her voice thin and unconvincing. Vanessa's expression darkened. Protocol. The word was a shield, one often wielded by those who use bureaucracy to mask their prejudice. But Vanessa had spent her career dismantling such excuses in boardrooms and shareholder meetings. She knew exactly how hollow they were. No, Vanessa said, the single syllable cutting through the air like a blade. You were following bias. The accusation landed like a hammer blow. Lisa flinched, her face flushing scarlet. Around them, customers and employees alike held their breath. The scene was no longer just about a deposit. It was about exposing the quiet, everyday racism that black customers faced in spaces where they should have been treated with the same respect as anyone else. Vanessa didn't stop there. She turned slightly, her sharp eyes scanning the bank until they locked onto the manager's office. I'd like to speak with your manager, she said, her voice still measured but leaving no room for refusal. Now. The command sent a ripple through the room. A junior teller near the back scrambled to fetch the manager, nearly tripping in their haste. Lisa, meanwhile, looked as if she wanted to melt into the floor. Her hands, which had earlier been so quick to scrutinize Kayla's cash, now trembled visibly against the counter. Within moments, the bank manager, a middle-aged man in a too-tight suit, emerged from his office, his face a mask of forced professionalism that couldn't quite hide his panic. He had clearly been briefed in rushed whispers, and his gaze flickered between Vanessa, Kayla, and Lisa, assessing the damage. Ms. Johnson, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What seems to be the problem? Vanessa didn't waste time. Your employee just accused my daughter of lying about the source of her money she earned legally at her job, simply because of how she looks. She paused, letting the words sink in. I'd like to know how your bank plans to address this. The manager's smile vanished. He shot Lisa a look that promised repercussions before turning back to Vanessa. his tone shifting to one of groveling apology. "This is not how we operate," he insisted. "We value all our customers equally. Lisa will be reprimanded immediately, and I assure you, we'll be reviewing our training protocols to ensure this never happens again." His words were smooth, practiced, the kind of corporate damage control Vanessa had seen 1,000 times before. But she wasn't here for empty promises. "See that you do," she said coolly. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned back to Kayla. "Let's finish your deposit." The dismissal was clear. The manager hesitated, then retreated with a stiff nod, dragging a shell-shocked Lisa with him. The moment they were out of earshot, Vanessa's posture softened just slightly, her hand coming to rest on Kayla's shoulder. "You okay?" she murmured. Kayla exhaled, the tension in her body finally easing. "Yeah," she said. Then, after a beat, "Thanks, Mom." Vanessa squeezed her shoulder. "No one should ever make you feel like you don't belong," she said quietly, "especially not here." The words weren't just for Kayla. They were for every black customer who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in a space where their money was just as good as anyone else's. As Kayla finally completed her deposit, without further interrogation, the whispers began. Customers exchanged glances, tellers murmured behind hands, and more than one person surreptitiously pulled out their phones. The incident wouldn't stay contained within these walls. By the end of the day, it would be the talk of the bank, then the neighborhood, then, inevitably, the wider world. Because this wasn't just about one teller's prejudice. It was about a system that too often looked at black customers and saw suspects instead of people, and Vanessa Johnson had just exposed it in the most public way possible. The aftermath of the bank incident rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves that would extend far beyond that single moment of confrontation. What had begun as a routine financial transaction had transformed into something much larger, a microcosm of systemic bias, a case study in corporate accountability, and ultimately, a catalyst for change. This final chapter examines the profound consequences of that day, the lessons embedded in its unfolding, and the enduring impact it left on all involved. The most immediate consequence was, of course, for Lisa Montgomery. Her suspension was announced before the end of the business day, a swift administrative action that nonetheless felt inevitable from the moment Vanessa Johnson had entered the bank. The official notice cited violation of customer service protocols and failure to maintain professional standards, carefully worded corporate language that danced around the real issue without ever naming it. Lisa's employment file, previously unblemished, now contained a disciplinary mark that would follow her through her banking career. More devastating than the formal reprimand, however, was the social fallout. Within hours, her actions had become the subject of water cooler gossip throughout the financial district, then morphed into a viral story as cell phone footage from bystanders began circulating on social media. The bank's response escalated rapidly as the story gained traction. By the next morning, a carefully crafted press release announced mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing staff, along with the formation of a diversity review committee. These were the kinds of measures corporations implemented when facing public relations crises, visible enough to demonstrate action, yet vague enough to avoid admitting institutional culpability. The branch manager, desperate to contain the damage, personally called Vanessa to offer apologies and assurances of reform. These gestures, while necessary, rang somewhat hollow. Everyone involved understood they were reactions to bad publicity rather than genuine commitments to change. For Kayla Johnson, the experience left complex emotional residue. There was satisfaction in having been vindicated, certainly, but also a painful awakening to the realities she would continue facing as a young black woman navigating professional spaces. The incident stripped away any remaining childhood illusions about fairness or equality, replacing them with the sober understanding that her credentials and character would often be secondary to people's preconceptions. Yet there was also empowerment in how her mother had handled the situation, not with explosive anger, but with the calm, unassailable authority of someone who refused to accept disrespect. This became a blueprint for Kayla's own future interactions with institutional bias. Vanessa Johnson's role in the aftermath extended beyond maternal protection. As a financial industry leader, she leveraged the incident to initiate broader conversations about racial equity in banking. At the next Financial Services Diversity Initiative meeting, she presented the episode, without naming specific individuals, as a case study in microaggressions and their cumulative impact on minority customers. Her testimony carried particular weight because it was both professional and personal. She spoke not just as a CEO, but as a mother who had witnessed her child being mistreated. This dual perspective lent authenticity to her calls for reform that might otherwise have been dismissed as political correctness. The incident's impact on the bank's customer base became apparent within weeks. Several prominent Black entrepreneurs and community leaders publicly shifted their business to other institutions, their announcements carefully worded to reference an environment more aligned with our values. Local civil rights organizations staged peaceful demonstrations outside the branch, their signs bearing slogans like "Our money is green too" and "Banking while Black." The branch saw a noticeable dip in new account openings from minority customers, even as it scrambled to implement visible diversity initiatives like featuring more people of color in its advertising. Perhaps most significantly, the episode sparked conversations in break rooms and dinner tables across the city about the subtle ways racial bias manifests in everyday transactions. White colleagues asked their Black coworkers if they'd experienced similar treatment. Parents used the story to teach their children about discrimination. Diversity trainers incorporated it into their workshops as a real-world example of microaggressions. The viral nature of the story meant that for a brief period, "Banking while Black" became shorthand for the extra scrutiny minorities face in routine situations. For Lisa, the personal reckoning came more slowly. Initially defensive, she clung to the justification that she had simply been doing her job thoroughly. But as she served her suspension and watched the unfolding public reaction, that narrative became harder to maintain. The breaking point came when her niece, a college sophomore, tearfully asked how she could have treated someone that way. This personal confrontation from someone she loved forced Lisa to examine biases she hadn't acknowledged in herself. While this introspection didn't erase her actions, it marked the beginning of genuine change, the kind that corporate diversity training often fails to achieve. The bank's long-term response proved a mixed bag. While they implemented the promised training programs and diversity initiatives, these often fell into the trap of checking boxes rather than fostering real cultural change. Teller turnover increased at the branch as some employees resistant to the new directives chose to leave. Yet there were positive signs too. The promotion of the bank's first Black branch manager in the region, revised cash handling policies that applied equally to all customers, and the establishment of a customer feedback system specifically designed to identify discriminatory practices. Kayla's story didn't end at the bank counter either. Months later, she would channel her experience into a powerful college application essay about racial bias in financial systems. The incident became a touchstone in her developing worldview, shaping her decision to study economics with a focus on equitable policy. Meanwhile, Vanessa found herself unexpectedly becoming a spokesperson for corporate accountability. Her calm dismantling of Lisa's bias held up as a model for addressing microaggressions in professional settings. The most enduring lesson from that day wasn't about any single individual, but about systems and the people who operate within them. It revealed how easily bias can become embedded in routine procedures, how quickly standard protocols can become tools of discrimination when applied unevenly. But it also demonstrated the power of speaking truth to that bias, not with hysterics, but with unassailable facts and unshakable dignity. In the end, the story resonated because it was both extraordinary and utterly ordinary. Extraordinary in having a CEO witness her child's discrimination, but ordinary in the sense that similar scenes play out daily in banks, stores, and streets across America, usually without witnesses or resolution. That's why Kayla's experience struck such a chord. It gave voice to countless unacknowledged moments of marginalization, and perhaps most importantly, it showed that these patterns can be interrupted. The bank incident became more than a viral story. It became a reference point in ongoing conversations about race, class, and access in America's financial systems. It reminded people that true equality isn't just about having the right policies on paper, but about the daily interactions that determine whether those policies live in practice. And for Kayla personally, it became a defining moment, not because it broke her, but because she emerged from it more determined to challenge the systems that had tried to diminish her. Years later, when Kayla would recount the story to her own children, she would emphasize not the pain of the discrimination, but the power of standing firm in one's truth. That perhaps was the most important lesson of all. That while bias might be inevitable, submission to it is not. The real victory wasn't in Lisa's humiliation or the bank's apology, but in the unshakable knowledge that no one gets to define your worth except you. And that lesson, once learned, can never be taken away.